There is a strange moment when you realize someone doesn't need you to believe them. They don't explain every decision. They don't rush to correct every misunderstanding. They don't turn every disagreement into a courtroom where they have to prove they're right, and somehow, that makes you pay more attention to them. Think about the person who walks into a room and never seems desperate to be noticed. They speak when they have something to say. They can admit when they don't know something. Someone can misunderstand them and they don't immediately fall apart trying to fix the other person's opinion. At first, you might mistake that for indifference, but sometimes it's something much deeper. It's confidence that no longer needs an audience. Because when a person is truly secure in who they are, they don't spend every moment trying to convince everyone else. And that's where human psychology gets interesting. Why do some people feel an almost unbearable need to explain themselves, while others can simply stand there, say what they mean, and let the world interpret it however it wants? The answer isn't that confident people don't care what others think. They do, they're human. They feel embarrassment, they feel rejection, they notice criticism. They can be hurt by being misunderstood. The difference is what happens inside them after that feeling appears. An insecure person may experience someone's disagreement as a threat to their identity. A secure person can experience disagreement as just disagreement. That small difference changes almost everything. Imagine someone tells you you seem arrogant. If you're deeply insecure about how people see you, that sentence can stay in your head all day. You might start explaining, "I wasn't trying to be arrogant. I was just tired. You misunderstood what I meant. I actually respect you," and maybe you keep explaining until the other person finally accepts your version of the story. But notice what happened. You weren't simply communicating anymore. You were trying to control their perception of you, and that's an exhausting way to live. Because the moment your sense of worth depends on being correctly understood by everyone, you've handed other people enormous power over your emotional state. Confident people slowly learn to take that power back, not by becoming cold, not by becoming arrogant, and certainly not by pretending they don't care. They simply understand something most people learn much later in life. You can explain yourself, but you cannot control what another person decides to believe. And once you truly accept that, something inside you becomes quieter. You stop chasing every misunderstanding. You stop turning every accusation into a debate. You stop feeling like your character is on trial every time someone disagrees with you. And that quietness can look incredibly powerful from the outside. Because we're used to people proving themselves, we see it everywhere. Someone posts a success online and immediately explains how hard they worked. Someone buys something expensive and explains why it was worth the money. Someone gets criticized and writes a paragraph defending themselves. Someone makes a decision and spends 10 minutes explaining why it was the right decision. Sometimes those explanations are completely reasonable, but sometimes there's something emotional hiding underneath them. The person isn't sharing information. They're asking for permission to feel okay about themselves, and those are two very different things. Confidence begins to grow when you no longer need every external reaction to confirm your internal reality. You can say, "This is what I believe," and someone else can say, "I disagree," and somehow you both survive. That sounds simple, but emotionally it's one of the hardest things to learn. Because humans are deeply social creatures, being accepted matters to us, being rejected can hurt, being misunderstood can feel unfair. And when someone challenges our reputation, our intelligence, our choices, or our character, the instinct to defend ourselves can become incredibly strong. But confidence isn't the absence of that instinct. It's the ability to pause before obeying it. That's an important distinction. A confident person doesn't necessarily think, "I don't care what anyone thinks." They may think, "I care, but I don't need to control it." That is a much healthier form of confidence. Because if you genuinely don't care about anyone's opinion, that isn't always confidence. Sometimes it's avoidance. Sometimes it's emotional numbness. Sometimes it's arrogance. Sometimes it's simply another way of protecting yourself. Real confidence is more balanced. You can listen without surrendering. You can accept criticism without collapsing. You can reject criticism without becoming defensive. And perhaps most importantly, you can allow someone to misunderstand you without immediately abandoning yourself. Think about how rare that is. Most people are constantly managing their image. How did I sound? Did they like me? Did I look confident? Did I say the wrong thing? Why didn't they reply? Why did they look at me like that? What are they saying about me? Why did they choose someone else? And slowly, without realizing it, life becomes a performance. You aren't simply living. You're watching yourself live through the imagined eyes of other people. Confident people aren't immune to this, but they become less dependent on it. They start asking a different question. Instead of, how do I make them see me the way I want to be seen, they ask, am I comfortable with who I am even if they don't see it? That question changes the entire psychological equation. Because proving yourself is often an attempt to close the gap between your internal identity and someone else's perception of you. But sometimes that gap cannot be closed. Someone might think you're selfish when you know you were simply protecting a boundary. Someone might think you're weak because you refuse to argue. Someone might think you're arrogant because you didn't seek their approval. Someone might think you failed because you chose a different path. And you can spend hours trying to change their interpretation, or you can continue living according to your values. That doesn't mean never explain yourself. There are moments when explanation matters. If you've hurt someone, communicate. If you've made a mistake, take responsibility. If someone deserves clarification, give it. Confidence isn't silence at all costs. It's knowing when explanation is useful, and when explanation has become emotional begging. There's a subtle difference. A healthy explanation gives information. An insecure explanation often asks for validation. Here's what happened, versus, please believe I'm not the kind of person you think I am. The first one communicates. The second one exposes a wound, and sometimes people can sense that wound. This is one reason over-explaining can unintentionally weaken your position. Not because explanation is inherently weak, but because desperation changes the emotional tone of communication. When you're desperately trying to convince someone, they can feel that you're attached to their agreement, and once they realize that, they may have more psychological power in the interaction than you intended to give them. This is especially visible in arguments. Imagine two people disagreeing. One person says what they believe. The other challenges them. The first person responds calmly, I understand why you see it that way, I see it differently. The second person pushes harder. But why? Explain yourself. So they explain, then comes another objection, another explanation, another objection, and eventually the conversation isn't about the original issue anymore, it's about winning. The confident person knows something the insecure person often forgets. Not every disagreement has to end in agreement. Some conversations simply end with two people seeing reality differently. And that's okay. Your confidence becomes much more stable when you stop treating disagreement as defeat. This is especially important in relationships. Think about how often people test each other's emotional security without even realizing it. A partner becomes distant. A friend stops replying. Someone suddenly seems colder. And immediately, the mind starts creating stories. Did I do something? Are they upset? Do they not like me anymore? Should I text again? Should I explain? Should I ask what's wrong? Sometimes communication is exactly what is needed. But sometimes anxiety creates an urgency that reality hasn't earned. Confident people learn to tolerate uncertainty. They can think, I don't know what's happening yet, and leave it there. That sentence is psychologically powerful. I don't know yet. Not everything needs an immediate interpretation. Not every silence is rejection. Not every change in tone is betrayal. Not every delayed response is a message about your worth. When you're secure, you become more comfortable with incomplete information. You don't need to immediately fill every empty space with a story about yourself. And this brings us to another reason confident people rarely prove themselves. They have a different relationship with uncertainty. Insecurity wants certainty. Confidence can tolerate ambiguity. Insecurity says, tell me what they think of me. Confidence says, they may think many things. I know what I think of myself. Insecurity says, make sure they understand. Confidence says, I'll clarify what matters and then I'll let them decide. Insecurity says, what if they judge me? Confidence says, they might, and strangely. That acceptance can make judgment less frightening. Because fear grows when you believe something absolutely must not happen. You must not be rejected. You must not look foolish. You must not fail. You must not be misunderstood. You must not lose. You must not disappoint anyone. But confidence says, maybe I will. And then, what will I do if I do? That's resilience. Not believing nothing bad will happen. Believing you can handle it if something bad does happen. There's another layer here that people often miss. Confident people don't need to appear confident all the time. They can say, I was wrong. I don't know. I need help. I misunderstood. I changed my mind. Those sentences can sound incredibly ordinary. But psychologically, they require a strong sense of self. Because if your identity depends on being intelligent, admitting you don't know feels dangerous. If your identity depends on being right, apologizing feels humiliating. If your identity depends on appearing strong, asking for help feels like failure. But someone with a more stable sense of self doesn't have to protect an image every second. They can lose an argument without feeling like they lost themselves. They can apologize without feeling smaller. They can learn without feeling exposed. They can be corrected without becoming defensive. That's one of the quietest signs of confidence: flexibility. The insecure mind often believes, if I change my position, people will think I was weak. The confident mind can say, I learned something, and there's nothing weak about that. In fact, it takes enormous internal security to update your beliefs, because confidence isn't about believing you're always right. It's about knowing that being wrong won't destroy your worth. This is why truly confident people can sometimes appear surprisingly humble. They don't need to dominate every conversation. They don't need to have the best story. They don't need to mention every achievement. They don't need to remind people how smart they are. They can let someone else shine. They can ask questions. They can listen. They can say, that's interesting, and mean it, because when you aren't constantly trying to establish your status, you have more attention available for understanding other people. And people often feel that. They feel when someone is listening because they are curious, rather than listening because they're waiting for their turn to impress. There's a quiet confidence in not needing to compete with every person in the room. And that doesn't mean you become passive. You can still have ambition. You can still want success. You can still care deeply about achievement. The difference is that achievement becomes something you pursue, not something you use to prove that you're worthy. That's a major psychological shift. When success becomes proof of your worth, every failure becomes a threat. When success becomes an expression of your values, failure becomes information. One damages your identity. The other develops it. Think about someone who loses a job. An insecure identity might immediately say, they rejected me, so I must not be good enough. A more secure identity says, this hurts. I don't like what happened, but this event doesn't define everything I am. That doesn't make the pain disappear. It simply keeps the pain from becoming an identity. And this is where confidence becomes much more than posture, eye contact, or speaking loudly. Confidence is what happens internally when life gives you evidence that doesn't match the story you hoped for. And you remain yourself anyway. You fail, you remain yourself, someone leaves. You remain yourself, someone criticizes you, you remain yourself. Someone misunderstands you, you remain yourself. Someone doesn't choose you, you remain yourself. That's powerful. Because eventually you stop trying to build a version of yourself that nobody can criticize. You realize there isn't one. No matter how kind you are, someone can call you fake. No matter how successful you are, someone can call you lucky. No matter how quiet you are, someone can call you weak. No matter how confident you are, someone can call you arrogant. No matter how carefully you communicate, someone can misunderstand you. If you spend your life trying to eliminate every possible negative interpretation, you will never be free. Confident people understand this. They don't aim for universal approval, they aim for internal alignment. Their question becomes, am I acting according to what I believe matters? That question is much harder, but much more freeing, because other people's opinions are constantly changing. Your values can become an anchor, and this is also why confident people often set boundaries without giving long speeches. Imagine someone repeatedly asks you to do something you don't want to do. An insecure response might involve a 10-minute explanation. I would, but I'm really busy and maybe another time, and I hope you don't take it personally. A confident response might simply be, I can't do that, that's it. Not because they don't respect the other person, because they respect themselves enough to understand that no doesn't always require a courtroom defense. Of course, context matters. Some situations deserve explanation. Some relationships deserve conversation. But there is a difference between explaining because someone deserves clarity and explaining because you're terrified they'll be disappointed. That difference is invisible from the outside, but you can feel it inside. And once you begin noticing it, you'll probably catch yourself doing something interesting. You'll notice the moment you start over-explaining. You'll hear yourself adding one sentence, then another, and somewhere underneath all those words is a quiet thought, please don't think badly of me. That is the moment to pause, not necessarily to become silent. Just to ask yourself, am I communicating, or am I trying to control their opinion? That question alone can change the way you speak. It can change the way you argue. It can change the way you handle rejection. It can change the way you move through relationships, because confidence isn't about having the perfect response. It's about not needing the perfect response to remain okay. Sometimes you will say the wrong thing, sometimes you'll look nervous, Sometimes you'll lose your temper. Sometimes you'll make a decision you regret. Sometimes someone will think less of you. Real confidence doesn't require perfection. It requires recovery. You can return to yourself. You can apologize. You can learn. You can try again. And you don't have to turn every mistake into a public trial against your own character. There's something deeply human about that. We all want to be seen accurately. We all want to be understood. We all want people to recognize our intentions. But maturity teaches you that intentions and perceptions don't always match. You can mean well and still hurt someone. You can be right and still communicate badly. You can be misunderstood and still be responsible for how you respond. Confidence lives somewhere in the middle, not in proving that you're perfect. Not in pretending you don't care, but in being honest enough to examine yourself without becoming dependent on someone else's approval. And maybe that's the deepest reason confident people rarely prove themselves. They've stopped confusing being believed with being worthy. They don't need everyone to agree with their identity. They don't need every room to validate them. They don't need every person to understand their choices. They know who they are, still being shaped by life. But they are not being rebuilt by every opinion they encounter. And there's an interesting paradox here. The less desperately you try to appear confident, the more confident you often become. Because performance requires constant monitoring, real confidence requires presence. When you're performing confidence, you're thinking, do I look confident? When you're actually confident, you're thinking, what is happening right now? That's a completely different mental state. One is self-conscious, the other is engaged. One is watching the mirror, the other is looking through the window, and maybe you've noticed this in certain people. They don't necessarily speak the most, they don't necessarily dress the best, they don't necessarily have the highest status, but when they speak, you listen, not because they're forcing you to. Because there is no desperation in their words. They aren't trying to convince you that they're important. They're simply comfortable enough to be present. And that kind of confidence cannot be faked for very long. You can imitate a confident posture. You can memorize confident phrases. You can lower your voice. You can pretend not to care. But eventually, insecurity reveals itself through the need to control. Control the conversation, control the impression, control the outcome, control the other person's opinion. Control whether you're liked, control whether you're understood, and the moment you realize you cannot control those things, you face a choice. You can become more anxious. Or you can become more grounded, you can keep proving, or you can start trusting yourself. That doesn't mean you stop improving, quite the opposite. When you no longer have to defend your worth, you can finally look at yourself honestly. You can say, I need to work on this, and not feel ashamed. You can say, I handled that badly, and not hate yourself. You can say, I want to become better, without believing that your current self is worthless. That's healthy confidence. Not superiority, not indifference, not pretending to be fearless. Just a quiet relationship with yourself that doesn't collapse every time the outside world disagrees. And maybe that's something worth practicing. The next time someone misunderstands you, pause before explaining. Ask yourself whether clarification will genuinely help. The next time someone criticizes you, listen for anything useful before deciding whether the criticism is fair. The next time you make a mistake, notice whether your mind immediately turns one mistake into a judgment about your entire identity. And the next time you feel the urge to prove yourself, pause. Ask, who am I trying to convince? Because sometimes, the person you're trying hardest to convince isn't the other person, it's you. And once you understand that, something changes. You stop performing strength. You start building it. You stop trying to look unshakable. You become someone who can actually be shaken and still find their balance. You stop needing to win every argument. You become more interested in knowing when an argument is worth having. You stop explaining every decision. You become comfortable letting your choices speak over time. And you stop chasing the feeling of being admired. You begin chasing something much quieter, self-respect. Because admiration comes from outside, self-respect is built inside. And the beautiful thing about self-respect is that it doesn't require an audience. Nobody has to clap, nobody has to agree. Nobody has to understand. You can simply know that you acted according to what mattered to you, and sometimes, that's enough. So perhaps the strongest person in the room isn't the one speaking the loudest. Maybe it's the person who doesn't feel the need to turn every silence into an explanation. The person who can hear criticism without immediately becoming defensive. The person who can admit uncertainty without feeling smaller. The person who can walk away from an argument without needing the final word. The person who can be misunderstood and still remain honest with themselves. That's not weakness. That's emotional freedom. And if this made you see confidence a little differently, you'll probably enjoy the deeper conversations we explore here at NEXMIND Core. Because in the end, confidence isn't about convincing the world that you're enough. It's about no longer needing the world to constantly remind you that you are. And perhaps the quietest sign that you've finally reached that place is that you stop looking around to see who noticed. You simply keep walking, quietly, honestly, as yourself.